The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, Odile Renaud-Bassot, will tour the Caucasus from 12 to 16 September, first visiting Azerbaijan, then Georgia, before concluding her trip in Armenia. This is President Renaud-Bassot's first in-person visit to the region since assuming office in late 2020. Global Finance, the world's leading finance publication, named NBG Governor Kobak among the best governors of the world's central banks in 2022. This is his 5th consecutive award. The new head of the EU delegation to Georgia, Paweł Herczyński, has taken up his duties in Tbilisi. Before joining the EU delegation to Georgia, Ambassador Herczyński was a managing director for Common Security and Defense Policy and Crisis Response in the European External Action Service in Brussels. His previous postings include serving as ambassador of Poland to the EU Political and Security Committee in Brussels, deputy permanent representative of Poland in the United Nations in New York, and Deputy Director of the EU Department in the Polish MFA. This is The Checkpoints, authored and presented to you by myself. I'm Elena Gwanjilashvili, and the Checkpoints team is ready to sum up for you the business and economics week. Let us start with the most important event for Georgia on 6 September 2022. The European Union and Georgia held the 7th meeting of the EU-Georgia Association Council in Brussels. The Association Council highlighted the historic importance of the decision of the European Council of 23 June 2022 to recognize the European perspective to Georgia. The participants acknowledged that the European Council expressed readiness to grant candidate status once the priorities specified in the Commission's opinion have been addressed. The future of Georgia and their citizens lies within the European Union. In this context, the EU welcomed that the work had started in the Georgian parliament and encouraged the ruling party to engage in an inclusive process with participation of representatives from the civil society and parliamentary opposition groups. The EU called on Georgia's political forces to unite, work together and engage to address these priorities as a matter of priority. The EU underlined that Georgia's European path is merit-based. The EU is ready to use all instruments to support it. At the same time, the Association Council highlighted the historic importance of the decision of the European Council of 23 June 2022 to recognize the European perspective to Georgia. The participants acknowledged that the European Council expressed readiness to grant candidate status once the priorities specified in the Commission's opinion have been addressed. The EU acknowledged that Georgia has carried out a number of challenging reforms and successfully approximated its legislation with the EU acquis in many sectors. The EU expressed, however, important concerns over the lack of substantial progress and negative developments in some key areas in 2021. The EU encouraged Georgia to redouble its efforts to further consolidate democracy and reduce the political polarization, to strengthen the rule of law, the independence, integrity, and accountability of the judiciary, and the fight against corruption. The EU also called upon Georgia to further enhance the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms, including gender equality, and ensure equal treatment between women and men, as well as persons belonging to minorities, regardless of religion or belief, ethnic or national origin, race, language, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, or other ground in social, political, and economic life, and stress the importance of media freedom and civil society engagement. We can listen to some of the main messages that came both from Brussels and Georgia.
The European Union accession is a merit-based process, that there are no shortcuts and no magic involved. It's not a matter of political declarations, but political will that converts wills on results. And only visible and tangible progress in reforms can drive this process forward. The criteria and expectations are very clear. When it comes to issues such as political culture based on inclusiveness, respect for the principles of democracy, the rule of law, the independence of judiciary, freedom of media, or alignment with European Union standards and policies. Georgia has decided to embark on the European Union path and also to take on these responsibilities, and now it's relevant is to deliver. Allow me to stress also that the accession process needs to be accompanied by a national consensus. I have shared our assessment on some key areas where Georgia's performance recently has raised some concerns, such as the judiciary, the rule of law, and media freedom, including increasing political pressure on independent oversight institutions and opposition media. These areas are crucial when it comes to European values and principles, and we count on Georgia's effort to address the existing shortcomings. Once again, the government first, the whole political spectrum after, and the whole civil society also. I'm looking very much forward to see Georgia advance on this path. And we hope that all Georgia's political forces will seize this historic opportunity and step up their efforts to obtain the candidate status and advance closer to the European Union.
This path leads us to where Georgia naturally belongs, namely in the family of European democracies where we share common values, have common goals, and promote peace and solidarity. The European perspective comes with huge responsibility, and we perfectly understand it, to ensure highest political, economic, and legal convergence with the European Union. The historic decision of the European Council created a whole new set of benchmarks that will play a game-changing role for Georgia. And yes, Georgia is fully committed to implementing 12 priorities as identified by the Council. We remain strongly committed to fully exploiting the potential of the association agreement, including the DCFTA. Very recently, we have adopted the new association agenda for 2021-2027, which reflects the ambitious goals on our common agenda. Achieving maximum integration into the EU single market remains one of our core goals. Developing connectivity between the EU and Georgia, especially in the Black Sea, promises important benefits to the wider region, especially given the current geopolitical context and the major challenges we all face, like energy security, food security. We have invited our EU colleagues to tap into a unique possibility that Georgia, as a potential key transit hub on EU's global connectivity map, can offer.
Another important event took place in Tbilisi, Georgia. Namely, Tbilisi hosted the two-day Tbilisi International Conference 2022, Slava Ukraini, by the McCain Institute at Arizona State University, the George W. Bush Institute, and the Economic Policy Research Center, EPRC. Experts, leaders, and policymakers from the United States and Europe held high-level discussions about Ukraine and Georgia, the future of NATO and the EU, and democracy in general, given ongoing Russian military aggression and disinformation. The conference occurred as Russian forces still occupy over 20% of Georgian land, and the Kremlin persists in nuclear and conventional sub-rattling and meddling in the internal affairs of Eastern European countries, including Georgia. Georgians know what it is like to live with a belligerent autocrat like Vladimir Putin as a next-door neighbor, and they know what it is like to have his army invade your sovereign country country, said McCain Institute Executive Director Dr. Evelyn Farkas. There is no better place than Tbilisi, Georgia, to discuss the future of Ukraine, the transatlantic relationship, and how to shore up our efforts to defend democracy and defeat Putin's aggressive and illegal foreign policy. I've been involved with this conference since it was started in 2014 by Nino Evgenidze and the PRC with the McCain Institute, said David J. Kramer, the Bradford Freeman Managing Director of Global Policy at the Bush Institute. I'm thrilled this year that George W. Bush Institute is a partner, which reflects our great interest in Georgia and the region. Indeed, this conference underscores the enduring friendship between the people of Georgia and the people of the United States during these very challenging times. David Kramer read out the message that President Bush has sent to Georgian people and the attendees of the Tbilisi International Conference 2022. We will never relent in our call for Russia to end its occupation of 20% of your nation's territory and for Moscow to respect your country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Even when we voice concerns about developments in your country, we do so as friends and allies of Georgia. We want to see Georgia succeed and take its rightful place as a full-fledged member of the democratic community of nations. This is especially true in light of Vladimir Putin's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine, something sadly to which Georgians can relate. Georgians can also relate to Ukrainians' desire to live in freedom and enjoy the fruits of liberty. The message from the 43rd President of the United States read. We dedicated our 6th annual reunion to Ukraine. We want to honor the Ukrainian people who are defending not only their independence and sovereignty, but also the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Whatever it takes, and as long as it takes, we stand for Ukraine, we stand for freedom, said PRC Executive Director Nino Evgenidze. This is the 6th convening of the Tbilisi Conference since 2014.
This is, as you are well aware, one of the main events happening in Georgia every year. Unfortunately, we had this 2-year pause caused by the pandemic, and now we have reinstalled, relaunched the conferences. We are very happy to see the heavy attendance on the conference. We have very interesting guests. We have a lot of experts, a lot of politicians. We have a lot of people who are dealing with the security policy issues in the region. And I think the panels which are scheduled today and tomorrow will address all the challenging items on the table of the contemporary world. Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine directly affects the situation in Georgia. Ukraine must win in order for the whole world to survive this Russian aggression against the democracy, against the free world, against the sovereignty of other countries.
Key participants in the 2022 Tbilisi conference, aside from Farkas, Kramer, and Evgenidze, include former U.S. ambassadors to Ukraine Bill Taylor, John Herbst, U.S. ambassador to Georgia Kelly Degnan, Echo from CSIS, and others. And the checkpoints had the chance to talk to some of them on different topics. The U.S. Ambassador Kelly Degnan was interviewed by McCain Institute Executive Director Dr. Evelyn Farkas in a special panel at the conference.
I think it's important to remember that the biggest threat to Georgia is Russia, to Georgia's security, its stability, truly its prosperity, as well as its democracy, is Russia. And it has been for centuries. This isn't new for Georgians. This is just the latest version of it. It is also important, I think, to remember that that is always in the back of many Georgians' mind, is that shadow, that long shadow of Russia that Russia uses so effectively sometimes to create confusion, to sow division, to instill fear in people. And you know, they're masters at that. They've been doing that for a long time. That is why the United States has spent 30 years helping Georgia improve its ability to deter and defend its own borders. It's a defensive approach that I think has proven very effectively in Ukraine, where a similar approach was taken. Build that capacity to defend your borders. And we are seeing now some important lessons play out in Ukraine as those years of training are put into action. It is a good question for this week in particular, because tomorrow I'm going up to the mountains to watch a tabletop exercise. Well, actually, it's a real-life exercise that involves emergency response capabilities that are part of a comprehensive defense approach that Georgia is developing with support from the United States and other NATO partners, because it is the modernization of Georgia's defense forces to be able to operate through a comprehensive defense approach. It furthers interoperability with NATO, which is something that Georgia has been excelling at because of its contributions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in other operating theaters with NATO and bilaterally with NATO allies. And then, of course, on Friday, we have the Distinguished Visitors Day that wraps up Noble Partner, which has been a large military operation that's done every other year, just to watch Georgia's, let's say, improvement in being able to now host a huge multinational exercise like Noble Partner, or last year, Agile Spirit. It's not the United States and Georgia doing this. It is Georgia organizing a multinational, large-scale exercise that really does test what we have seen in Ukraine to be essential military skills to defend this country and to work together as a really effective force. Our firm belief is that a strong defense force is the best deterrent to making Georgia once again a target of Russian aggression. So we are absolutely, as you said, Evelyn, working very hard to keep Georgia out of any kind of conflict, whether it's this Ukraine conflict or any other, by giving them the skills to be able to push back, defend their borders, conduct a resistance campaign that is a whole of society effort. That's a country like Georgia in this location and this size needs a whole of society response to the kind of threat that Russia presents. So the military cooperation is obviously long been at the core of our partnership, because we understand for Georgians, the first thing on their mind is the stability and security of their country. We can grow from there, and Georgia has grown from there, but that confidence that they can defend their own borders is at the heart of it. And we want to continue to be with them in developing that capability. We ask all of the countries, whether they're in this region or not, to do what they can to close the net, because that is how sanctions are most effective. Sanctions are intended to change behavior, and the best way to have them be effective is if there are no loopholes. And that is the message that we've asked the Georgian government too. The Georgian government immediately complied with the financial sanctions. We didn't even have to go in to ask them before the National Bank was closing that net, and has continued to be very vigilant about the financial sanctions. We work very closely as a result of our long partnership with Customs and with the Border Police to try and, again, close the loopholes, close the holes as much as we can at the ports and at the borders. And that is the result, to go to my earlier comment, that's the result of years of working together with Georgian agencies, building capacity, the training. We are seeing it come into play now, and the equipment that we've been able to provide, again, not just the United States, but other friends of Georgia's as well, to try and get a better sense of what is coming across the border or coming in through the ports. Of course, if you look around this region, there are examples that Georgia and others can point to and say, well, they're not doing it, or they're only doing this, and so it's not a, it's for those who are looking to for excuses. It's easy to point to neighbors that have more of an impact on the effectiveness of sanctions than some people here. Little Georgia, what can we do? I'm sure you've heard that argument. What we can do is continue to encourage Georgia to do everything it can, and the understanding that the victory of in this conflict, the fastest way to bring peace, which is what we are all working very hard to do, is bring peace as quickly as possible to Ukraine and this whole region, is for us to stick together on sanctions enforcement, watching for export control violations. And I'm sure you know that there's no slam dunk for that. All we can do is work as closely as we can with the partners through the capabilities, with the equipment that we've developed over the years. I can't give you a 100% it's not happening answer. I can say that we have seen cooperation with financial sanctions and with the agencies that we work with here to try and stem that flow as best as possible. And I think it's important that other countries, too, are doing the same, so that it is a stronger argument for all of us to be able to make. There needs to be an understanding of not just of the Black Sea, but how the Black Sea links up with Central Asia and Asia. I mean, I think we're starting to see that as we're all looking at alternatives to this northern corridor, and the really important role that Georgia can play in that, a huge opportunity for this country. And again, I think that opportunity needs to be developed even as these other challenges on other fronts are being worked and waged, because that's going to be part of Georgia's security and stability too. When it becomes an essential throughway for Central Asia, whether it's energy or goods, it will involve collaboration with Azerbaijan, with Central Asian states, with how the Caspian Sea is used in global trade and transport, as well as linking all those up to Europe. And of course, it's not only energy and transport that flow through those corridors, it's ideas, it's relationships, it's networking. And all of that, I think, is part of anchoring Georgia in that role between Europe and Central Asia. Anything that is anchoring Georgia more with its European neighbors and with Europe writ large is very positive, very strong. It's why these conferences are important. It's why your visits are important. We were very fortunate to have a bipartisan visit by Senator Shaheen and Senator Portman a year ago, and we've had other congressional delegations come despite COVID to demonstrate the concern about the democratic tensions here and the deep polarization, but also to demonstrate the deep and continuing support of the United States at every level: Congress, the White House, the State Department, the public, academics, people who know and love this country and are deeply invested in its success. And part of that, I think, is developing its role, not just in the South Caucasus, but in the broader region: Black Sea, Caspian, Europe, and Euro-Atlantic.
One of the, we could say, most important topics as the winter is approaching is, of course, gas prices, especially in the context of economic sanctions imposed on Russia because of its invasion in Ukraine. Ed Cho from CSIS said he is skeptical about the price cap idea.
It's impractical and it won't work. But I think more concerning is how long this has taken. The U.S. Treasury Department first floated this idea in the spring, and then the G7 leaders agreed to explore it at the end of June in the summit in Germany. And last Friday's statement from the G7 finance ministers contained no details about how they're going to implement this, including what is the level, the most basic question of what is the level of the price cap to be. And they're giving themselves until December to finally come up with a plan. And in the meantime, Ukrainians are dying and their country is being destroyed. So there's not the sense of urgency on the sanction, even if it were effective, why it's taken so long to put a plan together. So I would say that the G7 finance minister's statement was empty of real action.
On the discussion panel at Tbilisi International Conference 2022, Cho focused on the importance of communicating with the population for them to understand the importance of supporting Ukraine.
I would imagine for any government, it would put great stress on the politics of a country when consumers and industries' energy bills go up. Which is why I said during the panel discussion why we need to explain to our own population the stakes of this war in Ukraine, which we, at least in America, has not done as well, and some European countries have done better than others.
Cho believes that it will be a very hard winter.
Regardless of what actions you take now, gas prices have gone through the roof. There will need to be rationing in certain countries. Certain industries will have to stop production. So it's going to be tough. And I think the conventional wisdom is that Europe will go into recession this winter.
What is the way out of this situation? Cho elaborated a little bit on this part as well for the checkpoints.
Well, I think in the short run is to reduce demand, in all forms. So more conservation, greater energy efficiency would be needed. Getting additional supply takes much longer. You can cut your consumption in 1 or 2 years, but in order to get real supply increases, it takes maybe 3 to 5 years. So it's going to be a tough couple of years at least.
Georgia hasn't been affected much yet, such as Cho's impression and the impact of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Why? Here is his perspective.
Partly because it's not actually connected to the European market. You get most of your gas from Azerbaijan, but also Russia, and that continues to flow. I don't think the impact in Georgia, ironically, will not be as severe as it would be in Europe, which is not the usual circumstance. Usually Georgia gets hit worse. But I don't think in this case. Additional Azerbaijani gas transiting Georgia to European markets is potentially a good thing to happen.
According to Viola von Kramon, a German politician of Alliance 90, the Greens, who has been a member of the European Parliament since 2019, the only country benefiting from this war at this stage is Georgia.
Financially, economically, Georgia is the only country benefiting from the war. Lari has stabilized, the economy is almost skyrocketing, you have almost two-digit growth in the GDP. Russians come over with a lot of capital. That could be a political risk, but maybe at the moment it's good for Georgia. It's stabilizing the economy. So, of course, we would hope that the Georgian government has an interest to integrate more in the European market, to take the funds from the European Union for connectivity, to have this deep sea port, to have railway going on with connection to Azerbaijan and others. So there are a lot of projects going on, and for that, of course, we need to set up the additional standards where we are ready for, and we are also waiting for the Georgian government to commit on this.
In light of what we have opened today is the checkpoints, the homework that the Georgian government has to do before Georgia gets an EU candidate status, Viola von Kramon highlighted the judiciary reform as the crucial one on this path.
It's very important. I mean, without independent judiciary, without independence of judges and prosecutors, you cannot run a modern country. It is one of the crucial pre-measures before you start to implement other reforms.
Right after the checkpoints ends, we will offer you our reporter's Georgi Aronia's conversation with Kurt Walker, an American diplomat who served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO and served as executive director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership. He worked in a volunteer capacity as the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine until his resignation on September 27, 2019. And as we are approaching the end of today's The Checkpoints, I would like to highlight one business event this week that took place in Batumi, Georgia. We got the chance to interview Ken Zinger, who is the managing director and chief learning officer at UC Berkeley Center of Entrepreneurship. How to start a startup is the main question that Zinger will try to answer and share with those interested in a crash course on how to build a successful startup. Here are some interesting insights from Zinger for The Checkpoints.
This whole program is, it's actually a shortened program. We typically do a 3-week, it's more than a boot camp. A boot camp is a week. So it's typically a 3-week, just a crash course on how to start a startup. So in this boot camp though, this shortened version, what we want to do is inspire students who are very ambitious, that have a desire to make change in the world, to give them the tools, the inspiration, the examples of others who have done this, right? And to give them enough of a framework to practice the art of starting a company, so that by the end of this week, they will have experienced many of the same things that an industry entrepreneur will have experienced: the frustration, the joys of coming up with an idea, being able to tell a story about why their idea is so important and why they need to dedicate their careers towards doing something like this. So the learning environment is very different. Your typical university course involves an instructor up front and students sitting there taking notes and listening, and maybe at home reading a bunch of books. When you are training entrepreneurs, you have to create an environment that's similar to what an entrepreneur would experience, which is not sitting in front with an instructor and taking notes. It's really about creating something. So we have created a workshop environment where our instructors are walking amongst the students, looking at the projects they're working on, and really they're learning by doing. That's really at the core of the educational model, is that there is no more of an authentic way of learning than to have made your own mistakes and to learn from those that you've made, rather than to read about someone else's mistakes in a textbook. This is just a teaser, right? This is a 1-week, kind of the best hits in the week, to try to get students to enjoy the process, to get a flavor of it. And then we'll have the full program this upcoming summer in 2023 back here in Batumi. And we do these kinds of programs around the world. So we've held them in Hong Kong, we've held them in Italy, in France, in Estonia, and currently we do it every summer in Porto, Portugal. I've been to Georgia a few times, and each time I learn something new, as you will when you go to a new country. And I teach in probably a couple dozen countries every year. I just got back from India, and before that we were in Denmark. So we do these kinds of programs in many different ecosystems, in many different cultural contexts, and so I get to see the diversity of how people solve problems, how people see problems. And entrepreneurship I consider to be a native activity in every culture. In every country that you go to, there are natural entrepreneurs. There's always someone finding a new way of doing something, creating some new business. There's just some places that are more famous for it because they're creating companies that seem to be more global, right? That more people around the world know. What I found about the Georgian culture here is that there is this hunger, this just pervasive hunger to do something, to create something. And there seems to be, at least with the young people that I've worked with here in the last couple years, visiting and training startups and working with university students, there is this belief that they can do it, which is not normal. Not every country that you go to will you have such belief that they've got the ability to do big things. So I'm really inspired by that because it's what's required to take the first step, is the belief that you can do it, right? And if that's already here, if the students here already believe they can do big things, it's much easier for us and much faster for us to be able to give them the additional skills and the additional tools that will help them become successful faster. What we do at Berkeley is we try to measure entire career trajectories. So we will have a certain percentage of students who will start a company while they're in school. And then we'll get quite a lot of students who have graduated, gone to work for Google or Facebook or some other company, and then within 3 or 4 years, they come back and they start something. And then of course, years down the road, since I've been teaching for some time, we get some who come back 10, 12 years later. They're ready at that point. So what we look at in trying to measure success, right, is that our job is not to be a factory to create startups. Our job is to cross-train young talent to have the abilities to start a company when the inspiration hits, so they can activate those skills, activate those tools when the next big idea comes to them. And that might not be right away in school. That might not even be a few years down the road. It might be later on once they have accomplished many other things in their career. So we measure it in a longitudinal way, not an instant measurement of, how many companies have incorporated from your program. And the other way we measure is to look at long-term career trajectories. And we found with our Berkeley students, there are many that will never be entrepreneurs. They go through the program and recognize, look, this was useful, I enjoyed it. There's certain things certainly were more enjoyable than others, but the amount of risk that it takes to start a company is something that's not for them. But they'll use those skills to climb the corporate ladder faster. They will become directors of companies in a few years rather than a decade. They will be accepted into business schools earlier in their careers. They will have taken on major leadership roles as young people rather than seasoned executives. They have a much faster rise, but they also have many more options. They have many more opportunities to explore different industries. They have many more job opportunities because of the kind of training they've gotten, because so many more companies are looking for innovators to hire. They're not looking for the next, person who's been trained just to work on computers, because computers are getting good at working on computers. At some point, these computers are going to make your typical tech job obsolete. And so a lot of these tech companies prefer to hire students who are very flexible in their mindset. They are immediately creating on behalf of the company, that they're bringing in leadership skills so that the company doesn't have to train them for that. They're already coming in with a lot of that as a base coat. So in some ways, what we're trying to do is make Georgian students more competitive globally by having some of these skills that many of the students in the Silicon Valley, at Berkeley, at Stanford, and even MIT, the training they're getting there, hopefully the Georgian students who get the training here we'll be able to leverage all the same learnings that we're seeing in the most competitive universities.
And that's all for today. We will meet next Sunday on the same channel at the same time sharp. But before that, you already know what to do. Yes, follow us on Forbes.g and BM.g to keep updated on things that matter in business and economics. See you soon, and don't forget to watch our interview with Kurt Volker right after the checkpoint ends.
Mr. Walker, greetings. Thank you for being with us and answering our questions today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Mr. Walker, we all remember the chaos that took over the world as the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. But out of all the noise, one thing stood out: how US officials on numerous occasions claimed that Kiev would fall within 24 to 48 hours. So let me ask you this: how was intelligence so wrong?
Oh, well, thank you very much. First off, you are right. Official U.S. government statements and others who are observing were saying that Kiev would fall in 2 to 3 days. I said the opposite at the time, and before that I said that Ukraine will actually win the war. I wrote an article about that in January, and it's clear that that's what's happening now. So what went right and what went wrong? First off, U.S. intelligence, I think, was quite right, exactly right, in assessing both Russian military buildup around Ukraine and also Russian intentions to actually conduct a massive invasion of Ukraine. I personally thought that if Putin was smart, he would have only tried to take Donbass and the southern part of Ukraine, but he overdid it. He tried to take everything, and that's what failed. Now, what U.S. intelligence got wrong, many, many things. They grossly overestimated the capabilities of Russian forces. Russian forces are a disaster. They grossly underestimated Ukrainian capabilities, and they grossly underestimated Ukrainian resolve. And I remember that famous episode where the U.S., I think, I find it embarrassing, we offered Zelensky a plane to get him out of Ukraine. I think that's a horrible thing for us to have done, at least in such a public way. And Zelensky quite rightly said, I don't need a plane, I need guns, I need ammunition, I don't need a ride. So I think we got so much of the balance of forces wrong and the balance of will. Since then, the Ukrainians have shown that they are quite capable. They have incredible resolve and determination and organization and resilience as a population. And they are fully able to use all of the assistance and support that the U.S. and other countries are giving them. So we should have given it to them much, much earlier.
Do you think that the assumption that was made publicly was the right thing to do in the beginning, in the very, very beginning of the war?
No, I don't. I think that Zelensky was right. I think that you should not give any reason to lower the morale or cause doubt or despair in your population. I think you want to show strength and resolve and determination. That's what Zelensky did. And I think these public statements from the United States that, oh, Kiev's going to fall, were frankly not helpful.
What is going on in Ukraine today, in your assessment?
Yeah, Ukraine is slowly winning the war. The first part, Russia sought to eliminate Ukraine as a country, as a people, as an identity, complete genocide. And that failed. They were unable to achieve that goal. The Ukrainians stopped them. They destroyed columns of tanks and lots of soldiers and pushed them out. Then Russia focused, as I thought they would originally, on Donbass and the south. And they made very minor gains and have exhausted themselves. And now Russia has no capacity for substantial offensive gains in Ukraine anymore. And Ukraine is now disrupting and dismantling Russia's ability to sustain and supply its forces in the field. So they're destroying fuel, logistics supplies, ammunition, food supplies, bridges, roads, railroads, command posts, so that the Russians are finding it increasingly difficult to sustain their forces in an advanced position. As this continues, the Ukrainians are then able to slowly take territory back. And as the winter sets in, it's going to get even more difficult for the Russians. So eventually the Ukrainians will push the Russians out of Kherson. They will probably disable Russian military capabilities in Crimea. They will break the line of communication from Rostov, Donbass to Crimea on the land bridge. They'll interrupt that line of communication. And then next year, I think the war will continue, and I think the Ukrainians will continue to push the Russians back.
Mr. Walker, back in March, Donald Trump said, and I quote, "I stand as the only president of the 21st century on whose watch Russia did not invade another country and neither did anyone else." There is an opinion that would Donald Trump be president right now, the war would not have happened. What's your take on that?
It's impossible to know. It's impossible to know. Putin launched this war not because of the United States. He launched the war because he wanted to rebuild the Russian Empire. And he said this himself. He wants to be Peter the Great. He wants to be seen as a great czar who accumulated the territories. And I think he's driven by that, whether or not Biden or Trump is president. Now, the only thing you can say about Trump is he was very unpredictable. And I think that would be something that Putin would have had to calculate. And I also think the catastrophic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan influenced Putin's decision-making. We demonstrated a lack of willingness to use force, a lack of commitment even to rescue our own people. And Putin saw this. And I think that he believed that we didn't have the will to support Ukraine. Turns out he was wrong on that. We do have the will to support Ukraine. But I think that influenced his thinking.
Sadly, Putin's war in Ukraine is not the only military invasion that Russia undertook under his regime, his or President Medvedev's regime. So we could even say that, as you just rightly said, that this is just one step towards this goal of rebuilding or recreating the Russian Empire. Yet, what we saw this time was the unprecedented unity in the West, in general, overall in the West, that we didn't see, or maybe we saw not in this proportion during the war in Georgia. So, in your opinion, if NATO and the Western countries reacted to the war in Georgia in any different way, was there a possibility so that this invasion of Crimea, invasion of Ukraine would not have happened?
Well, a couple things I would want to come back to even in your question. I don't think the degree of Western unity that we saw with Russia's invasion in February was unprecedented. I think we've seen other examples of that as well. And I remember I was ambassador to NATO just after Russia invaded Georgia. There was a high degree of unity for a brief period of time. We had foreign ministers coming here. We had Sarkozy flying to Moscow to get the Russians to stop advancing. We had the U.S. flying Georgian troops in military aircraft back to Georgia, landing in Georgia with U.S. military aircraft, putting 2 destroyers in the Black Sea. And within, a very short period of time, the Russians agreed to stop advancing and return to the positions that their forces were in before August 6th. So I actually think we did a good job in Georgia in terms of stopping the Russian attacks. The war in Ukraine started in 2014 and it's still going on, and it got worse in 2022, and that's still going on too. So I think that a lot was done actually to help protect Georgia at the time. What we failed at, and we are still failing, is to get the Russians to leave South Ossetia and Abkhazia. We had a process set up after 2008 in Geneva for focusing on Russia's continued occupation and pressuring them to implement the ceasefire that they agreed to. And the West has lost attention and just dropped the ball on this. And so Russians have done nothing positive since then. They recognize them as independent states. They do this creeping borderization. So we failed Georgia after the fact. Now, in terms of what we could have done to prevent Russia's invasion of Crimea and Donbass. I think there's several things there. Yes, if we had been even more forceful in Georgia at the time and really provided military assistance, and if we had made good on bringing Georgia into NATO and Ukraine into NATO, I think that would have definitely changed Putin's calculations. In the period between 2008 and 2014, it was difficult in Ukraine. You had Yanukovych in power. But when Yanukovych then killed some of his own people and fled the country, there was an opportunity with the Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan, to repackage Western support for Ukraine, to really take advantage of the opportunity of the Maidan to say, okay, Ukraine has now entered a new and hopeful state again. Let's really help them this time. Let's give them better security, assurances, arms, training, equipment. Let's help them build their democracy. And here, as you'll remember, instead we imposed an arms embargo on Ukraine and said, okay, no lethal defensive equipment for you. And that, I think, also was a signal to Putin that he has an open field in Ukraine.
You just mentioned Georgia joining NATO. Did you mean that it would have been good if Georgia joined NATO pre-war or post-war?
Both.
Both.
Pre-war would have been the best, because I think it would have deterred Putin.
Was it feasible?
Well, no. If you remember the Bucharest summit, we have very strong opposition from other NATO allies. The US wanted to move forward with the membership action plan, which was a partial step towards membership, but other allies didn't want to do that. So it wasn't feasible at the time. But I'm saying that if we had done it, I think it would have deterred Putin. But then after the war, it would have been the right step. Give Georgia a membership action plan and move forward towards Georgian membership in NATO under the Rasmussen formula, under Article 5 for the non-occupied territories. Don't support violence to retake the occupied territories, only support the peaceful reintegration of these areas. I think that would have been the right thing. And now, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what we've seen, I think when the fighting in Ukraine is over, we must move forward with NATO membership for all the countries in the region.
What became evident, especially after the war in Ukraine, is that Putin's actions, even though he claims they are caused by Ukraine joining NATO or Georgia joining NATO, what we see is that his actions don't really reflect that. That's right. So how can we ensure that, for instance, in parallel to the war in Ukraine, Putin does not do something else towards other countries that are of his interest?
Well, of course, we can't guarantee anything, what Putin will or won't do. He's not acting rationally. However, his military forces are having an extremely difficult time in Ukraine. They are losing the war, they're being pushed back. He's had to go to prisons to try to recruit more soldiers. He's had to open recruiting stations in Moscow and St. Petersburg. He says he needs to increase the military by 137,000 people. So it's clear that this is not going well. With that in mind, I think the last thing he wants to do is open another front, because that would make it even more difficult for the Russian military.
Just now, before our interview began, there was news published that Putin signed a doctrine, humanitarian doctrine, in which one of the points is that he says that Russia will proactively look towards how other countries defend the rights of Russian people in their countries. This is the pretext that he quite frequently uses before invading different countries. So do you think this is a risk for Georgia? And in general, how do you see Georgia today, given the war in Ukraine? Are we at threat of being invaded?
I think that this is Putin trying to signal something domestically, that he's standing up for Russian people because he's losing the war. So I don't think there's any seriousness to the threat now of invading Georgia or Lithuania or Estonia. He's using this as a domestic device.
Let's talk about sanctions. We've seen a lot of financials, different types, amounts by different countries, a lot of financial sanctions towards Russia. But then by their nature, sanctions tend to be very long-term solution. So, and even sometimes they might not even yield the result they are intended to. So given this, what can we do as the world, as the Western part of the world, for instance, what can Western countries do to limit Putin's ability to just continue the war in Ukraine and make sure that he learns his lesson?
Yeah, there are so many things. So first off, the sanctions that have been passed are actually very robust, better, stronger than any other sanctions we've done to this date. And that particularly is important for imports into Russia, limiting the financial transactions that back up such imports, so it's much more difficult. We're seeing shortages in Russia, some key components such as semiconductors. They're not able to make new precision-guided munitions at this point. They're not able to make new cars with all the sensors and the things that are needed. So these are having an impact on the country. It's going to be degrading over time. We could be toughening up these sanctions. We should be toughening up these sanctions. For instance, we limited it to the big 4 Russian banks. Why not all Russian banks? Why are we trying to allow some transactions to go through? The Europeans in particular could follow the US lead. The US banned imports of Russian oil and gas. The European Union should take the lead in doing this. Right now it's passive and waiting to see whether Russia cuts off supplies to Europe. They should take the tough decision and do it themselves and deny Putin that revenue. So there are many more things that we could do. And I think the more we get other countries to avoid helping Russia bust the sanctions. We see examples of Turkey, we see examples of China. That's also important because that takes some of the pressure off of them. But even with all of that said, the combination of Putin destroying his military in Ukraine and destroying the Russian economy because of the sanctions as a result is putting Russia on a long-term downward trajectory. And the leadership in Russia, the elites in Russia know it.
In parallel to what you just said, Putin uses his energy resources as a political weapon. Yeah. So in your opinion, is this what he has in mind, the destroying the European or Western unity through this? And we see some emerging examples, of countries being very dependent on oil and gas. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as a threat for the Western society?
I think already the European Union, the West, has done enough to survive the winter without people freezing and dying. They're going to have power. Be expensive. It's going to cost more, but it's going to be fine. I think he's trying to use energy as a weapon in order to get the West to stop supporting Ukraine. Saying, is it worth it to us to go through this difficult winter and pay high energy prices to help Ukraine? Why not just tell the Ukrainians to give the Russians some territory and be done with it? That's what he's trying to achieve. I don't think it's going to work. I think that Europe has both made itself more resilient already, and I think European publics understand the game. They know what Putin is trying to do, and they're not going to sell out Ukraine.
But what if it works for certain, or let's say at least one European country? In the EU, given the consensus mechanism, it's important that all the countries join. So what if, let's say, Hungary or any other country asks this question, this very vital question, and very legitimate question as well to themselves, and they find that, maybe we should stop doing that. Then what's going to happen?
I think that Hungary is not going to be able to stop the rest of the European Union from moving away from Russian oil and gas when they choose to do it. Russia is trying to ration oil and gas to Germany and to the rest of Europe in order to generate pressure. So, for instance, they shut down the Nord Stream pipeline over the weekend, and they, surprise, surprise, they haven't reopened it yet. So they're trying to make a point. They have shut down the southern pipeline that goes to Hungary, Druzhba, partly because it goes through Ukraine. I have a feeling that the rest of Europe is the target for Putin, not Hungary really, And Hungary won't be able to change the direction here where Russia is trying to pressure and the EU is not going to succumb to the Russian pressure.
In this context, what should Georgian government do? How should our government act? You know, because we're in a very difficult context here. We have Russia right bordering us. So what's your take on that?
Yeah. So first thing, it's very important to make clear that no one is asking Georgia to join the war against Russia. That is a myth that has come up in Georgian political discussion, and it is completely false. No one is doing that. The United States is not joining the war against Russia. We made it very clear. We prohibit our own uniformed personnel from training the Ukrainians in Ukraine. We don't let them go in. So the idea that the United States or someone is pressuring Georgia to join the war, it is nonsense. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Georgia was the first victim of Russian wars to steal territory before Ukraine. And Russia still occupies 20% of the territory. So I understand why it's important for Georgia to not put itself in a vulnerable position where it can be attacked again. But I think also showing solidarity and understanding for what the Ukrainians are going through when they're actively being attacked by Russia is very important. And then the third thing is to explain better. The communications here have not been good. Explain better that Georgia already has a number of sanctions in place, or that it passively applies for a variety of reasons because of Russia's aggression against Georgia. There's no ambassador of Russia in Georgia or Georgia in Russia. There have been restrictions on imports from Georgia into Russia. There are financial sanctions that are passively applied because the Georgian banks don't want to be caught up in sanctions that apply to the international banking system. So to communicate about this a little bit more proactively, to say, you know, Georgia is not in a sanctions-busting position. I don't think that this has come out as clearly as it should.
Mr. Walker, just recently, Fitch Ratings claimed that the war in Ukraine, quite oddly, is a positive short-term shock for the Georgian economy, mainly because of the influx of a lot of Russian-speaking population from Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. In your opinion, is this dynamic a threat to Georgia in one way or another, or how should we look at it?
Look, everything has pluses and minuses. And yes, there has been these Russians who have come into Georgia have brought money with them, they buy things, they stimulate the economy. Okay, that's one thing. But who are these people? What are their long-term plans? Do they support Georgia, or do they support Russia, which is an enemy of Georgia, which attacks Georgia, which occupies Georgian territory? I think that there ought to be some tracking of who the people are, and I think there ought to be some kind of request or understanding that if they're going to be residing in Georgia, getting residency or possibly even citizenship, that they reject Russia's aggression against Georgia at a minimum, as well as aggression against other countries. So I think more can be done there. There are positives to it, but there are also negatives. And then let's also remember the types of people we're seeing. They're all different kinds. You can't put a label on this. Some of them, as you said, are from Belarus, who are fleeing an oppressive regime there. Some of them are from Ukraine, where the Russians are killing Russians in Ukraine, Russian speakers in Ukraine. Most of the people who died in Mariupol, in Severodonetsk, in Kharkiv, these are Russian-speaking people that the Russians killed. So they're fleeing those conflicts. Some of them, however, are Russians who really just want to preserve their money. They're afraid that the Russian economy, with all the sanctions, is going to collapse, and they want to protect themselves and their families. That's understandable. But some of them are also pro-Putin and Russian nationalists, and they think that, that Russia deserves to take territory from other countries. And those people have to be told, you're not welcome here.
My last question would be, after this war ends, and ends with Ukraine triumphantly winning it, will Georgia join NATO?
I think so. No, I'm a minority in this point of view. But I think what's going to happen here, first off, Russia will lose the war. And this will be devastating for Putin. He will have destroyed the Russian military, and he will have destroyed the Russian economy, and no one in Russia will think it was worth it. So that'll be trouble for him. That means something's going to snap inside Russia. Who knows what, who knows when. Maybe it'll be immediately after the war, maybe it'll cause the end of the war, or maybe it'll be a few years, but something is going to snap. And at the same time, Ukraine will recover all of its territory and will be looking for security guarantees so that there's never a war like that again. And the only security guarantees that work are NATO membership. This Budapest Memorandum, the coalitions of the willing, they don't count. NATO is the thing that counts. And so I think we will come back to Ukrainian membership in NATO. They would be the most capable military, one of the largest, one of the most experienced, one of the most contributing members of NATO if they joined. And at that time that that happens, I think it's incredibly important that Georgia not be left behind, Moldova not be left behind, and we figure out how we advance the Balkan states as well. This all has to move forward. These gray zones are a threat to everybody.
Well, we certainly hope so. And thank you very much, Mr. Walker.
Thank you very much.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.